afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Legal Aid Society's annual The People's Court, our Facebook Live summer sessions. My name is Teresa Morrison, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for Legal Aid Society, and the person who will be running and moderating our Facebook Live sessions over the next couple of months. Tonight, I am very excited to have one of our awesome attorneys here with us, Trina Hughes. Trina is an attorney in our Oak Ridge office and joined Legal Aid Society February 2020. So she was here with us right at the cusp of the pandemic, not to bring that up again. Before joining Legal Aid Society, Trina worked as an elder law attorney at the East Tennessee Human Resource Agency. She's a graduate of the University of Tennessee College of Law. And during her time at law school, she participated in mediation clinics and will clinics. Throughout law school, Trina has been an advocate as well as a volunteer and a faithful volunteer with Legal Aid Society. She has her graduate degree from Lipscomb University, where she studied philosophy and French. Oh, French. Okay, Trina. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to Trina as she introduces the topic she's going to talk about tonight.
Thanks, Teresa. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to start off this summer series talking about fair housing. And we wanted to do this fair housing presentation during June because we really want to highlight the particular fair housing protections that LGBTQ plus people have under the Fair Housing Act. I'm going to apologize in advance if my pets are a distraction. I'm on this call from home and my animals only need to pay attention to me when I'm on a video. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is Legal Aid Society? Legal Aid is a 501c3 private nonprofit law firm. We provide education and representation in civil matters for low-income individuals and families, especially including seniors who normally could not afford legal services. Our mission is to advance, defend, and enforce the legal rights of low-income and vulnerable people to help them secure the basic necessities of life. We are the largest nonprofit law firm in the state of Tennessee, and we have 43 attorneys covering 8 offices that provide help across 48 counties. So from the math that our excellent team has done, there's over 360,000 people who could be eligible for our services. So that is basically one legal aid attorney for every 8,000 citizens who might need our help. So here is our nifty little map. So you can see by the color of the office, which office covers you. If you ever want to call legal aid to see if we can help with your issue, doesn't matter which number you call, we'll get you sent to the right office. We help with many areas of law, including bankruptcy, consumer protection, education, housing, immigration, and tax. And just a brief disclaimer, this wouldn't be a presentation by an attorney if there wasn't a little disclaimer. A lot of the work that I do with fair housing is funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The substance and finding of the work is dedicated to the public. The author and presenter are solely responsible for the accuracy of this, and any information that I'm sharing today does not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. I also want to let all of you know that the information in this presentation is for information and should not be considered legal advice. Laws change regularly or modified, so please talk to an attorney. Please call us for help if you have a specific issue or a specific question. But all the information we're giving today is just information. So the Fair Housing Act, this is a great quote from the statute. It's a policy of the United States to provide within constitutional limitations for fair housing throughout the United States. The Fair Housing Act has these following protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. The Tennessee Fair Housing Act has added on creed, which has been interpreted as a very strongly held belief. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what some of these mean. Sex. So this is what we really want to talk about. We really want to talk about Dairy Pride. In the past, when we talked about sex discrimination in fair housing, it was often just biological sex as shown on your birth certificate. So if you were assigned female at birth and you were treated in a sexist way by your landlord, that would be considered sex. New guidance. So this in 2021. So if anyone's familiar with the law, anything within the last 5 years is brand new. So this is still very new to us. Um, the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is also considering discrimination that's based on sexual orientation and gender identity as part of sex, as part of the class of sex, meaning that it is illegal to discriminate against someone because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So that includes trans people, gay people, everyone under the LGBTQ plus. And there is a new toolkit available on the HUD Exchange website, and Teresa has added that here. You can find the link to that. It's a really helpful resource. Familial status. So familial status, one thing that's really important to note here is familial status is it's always talking about children, minors. So it's not talking about a family that might be comprised of multi-generation, but everyone is over 18. But if any kind of minor living in the home, one or more persons under 18 living with a parent, any caregiver, essentially. There's lots of different kinds of family out there. It includes anyone who's pregnant or in the process of getting legal custody, or it just has permission for the minor to live with them. Sometimes people are still unfortunately facing situations where housing providers say, well, we don't want minors living here. This isn't a place for children to live, or oh, you're pregnant, and that's kind of risky. We don't want you living here. We don't want to have to deal with you not being able to pay rent. So all of those situations would be discrimination based on familial status. Disability. By far, both in our office and from what we hear across the country, in every region, I believe, of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the primary reason for people filing complaints about their fair housing rights being violated is due to disability. Disability under the Fair Housing Act is a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. You do not have to be receiving disability income to be considered disabled according to the Fair Housing Act. You don't even have to have a disability to always be protected by the Fair Housing Act. You can have a record of an impairment, or people can think you have an impairment. One situation I've heard of, I've never seen, is that sometimes in small towns, maybe you have a relative who has a mental health condition. And so maybe a housing provider doesn't want to rent to you because they think, oh, people in this family have mental illness. We aren't going to let you live here. That's discrimination based on disability, despite the fact that you don't have a disability.
You gotta love the fur babies.
She loves being right in front of the camera. She has to show off. Um, and there are special protections in addition. We're going to get to this later in the presentation. There's special protections that people who are discriminated against based on their disability have. Some exceptions to disability is that if you are currently illegally using drugs, then you were not protected. However, if you have a history of substance abuse disorder, but you are not currently using illegal drugs, then you are protected by the Fair Housing Act. There's also a weird part brought into the law that we always bring up, that you don't have disability protections because you are transgender. However, you are protected under the category of sex if you are a trans person. You just don't have the extra disability protections. And we'll talk more about that when we get to that section of the presentation. So the covered markets. So if you have questions, please ask them. I will be upfront and say here at Legal Aid, we are working mostly with low income people. Most of the experience that I've had has been regarding rental homes. However, the Fair Housing Act covers home rentals, it covers sales of homes, lending, so getting a mortgage, home insurance, zoning laws, so in cities, counties, it applies to all of them. Advertisements is something we deal with here. Basically, anything connected with residential housing, anything related to putting a person or a family into a home is covered by the Fair Housing Act. Covered dwellings, private and subsidized units. So I think some people get the idea that, oh, Fair Housing Act only applies if you live in public housing. Fair Housing Act only applies if you get a Section 8 voucher. That's not true. The Fair Housing Act applies to almost every residential tenant situation. If you live in a single family home, multifamily unit, if you're in a shelter or a group home, if you're in an assisted living facility or in a college dorm. When I was in college, I had no idea that the Fair Housing Act would have applied. Basically, any place where you live, the Fair Housing Act is probably going to apply. The covered entities, so the owners of the property and the managers, the management companies, they're both responsible for following the Fair Housing Act. Homeowners associations, HOAs, they often don't realize but the Fair Housing Act applies to them as well. Condo boards, like I mentioned before, lenders, real estate agents. Real estate agents have a huge history in the Fair Housing Act. They are who they're required. They have to show you properties regardless of your race in neighborhoods, regardless of the racial and ethnic breakdown of those neighborhoods. The government has to follow the Fair Housing Act, especially with zoning regulations like we talked about before. Insurance companies, basically anyone involved with residential housing has to follow the Fair Housing Act. So we're going to talk about different protections that are afforded for different protected classes. Most of these apply to everything, and we'll get to the special ones in a minute. So no, you cannot be, they cannot refuse to rent, sell, or negotiate with you for housing because you're a member of any protected class. You can't set different terms, conditions, or privileges for sale or rental of a dwelling. So I heard recently a story about an African American gentleman who was unable to get housing because he received a background check and they found something in his background that the housing provider was not happy with. So they denied his ability to live there. However, they determined that many other residents had similar backgrounds, but they only checked, the housing provider only checked the people who they thought were suspect for having that kind of history. So that is different terms and conditions. If you want to have a policy, it has to be the same for everyone. One thing that is really common is falsely denying that housing is available. So maybe the housing provider is super nice, and maybe a couple comes in and they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we don't have any facilities available. We don't have any apartments available." But they do. That would be falsely denying that housing is available. And we work with other organizations that have testing. So when people have these problems and they call us, we can work with our partners to have different people go out and test the situations, make phone calls to these housing providers, see if they replicate the discriminatory act that they did when our client interacted with them. So we have a lot of really cool ways to figure out if this is actually happening. So these are the special protections that people with disabilities have. There's two kinds. There's reasonable modifications and reasonable accommodations. Reasonable modifications are changes to the physical structure of a building. The most common ones that we think about with this are grab bars for the bathroom, ramps so you can get in and out of your home easier, maybe needing a different kind of flooring. Some people, because of their physical mobility issues, need carpeting. They need flooring with more resistance. Some people, because of their breathing issues, need some kind of laminate or hard flooring because dust accumulates in the carpeting and that's bad for their breathing. The tenant usually has to pay for the modifications unless a property is subsidized. If you live in public housing and you need this kind of modification, your public housing authority should pay for it. Reasonable accommodations are a change to a rule or a policy relating to housing transaction. The landlord usually pays for any expenses relating to accommodations in both private and subsidized properties. And common accommodations we see are if someone, because of their disability, their only income is disability income, Social Security disability, then maybe they don't get their check on the first of the month when rent is due. They get their check on the third. So a really common accommodation is that the landlord would allow them to pay their rent on the day that they receive their disability income. So some special rules for modifications and accommodations. There has to be a connection between the disability and their requested change. So if I have anxiety and I ask for a grab bar, there's not really a connection there. So we don't really know, okay, you have anxiety, I'm sorry, I don't know how the grab bar is going to help that. But if you have anxiety and your doctor has recommended that you have an emotional support animal, then that is a connection. Or like I mentioned before, if you have asthma and you need a laminate or hardwood flooring, there's a connection there. Some disabilities are obvious. Some disabilities you can see when you look at a person, you can tell they have a disability. Most disabilities are not visible. And if your landlord cannot see your disability, they can ask for verification. If it's obvious, they don't need to ask for that. But they can get a note from a doctor, a peer support group. I've heard of people getting letters from their AA sponsor. They have a substance use disorder. They aren't currently using any substances. So there are other organizations that can provide that information. It doesn't need to be at the diagnosis. The landlord doesn't need to know all of your health specifics, but they need to know enough to build that connection between the disability and the requested change. So I got a little bit ahead of myself. They can ask for verification of your disability. They can ask for a description of the needed modification. And they can ask for an explanation of the connection between the disability and the modification. You aren't entitled to a modification or accommodation if you don't ask for one. You have to ask for what to be able to get it. Your landlord can't read your mind. They don't know the future. They don't know everything that's going on with you. Maybe you have a lot of trouble walking up and down stairs. You need a ground floor unit. Your landlord's not watching you go up and down the stairs struggling, so they don't know that. You have to ask for it. There's no particular way you have to request a reasonable accommodation or modifications. Sometimes housing providers will say, oh, you have to ask for it on this form. That's not correct. You just need to let them know. I do recommend you do it in writing. That can include over email, and actually email is really great because then you have a record of the exact time you sent it. You can also do a letter and send it certified and just make a copy of anything that you send. Keep track of the dates. And if they delay unnecessarily, then that can also be considered a denial. If the landlord thinks a request is unreasonable, he should discuss alternatives with the tenant. So If I ask to completely have my whole home rebuilt, the landlord's going to say, okay, that's a little too much, but let's talk options. And then this is called, then this process, the landlord may say, well, what if we move you to a ground unit? Or what if we do this? They can't just say no, but they can ask that you enter this, and it's called the interactive process. If what you're asking for is reasonable, the landlord shouldn't propose alternatives. So, what we mentioned earlier in that if you don't receive your disability income until the third of the month, that's not going to be an undue hardship for your landlord to accept your rent on that date. That's just almost the definition of a reasonable accommodation. So your landlord does not need to propose an alternative to that. They also can't say, well, you can do this, but you have to pay all this extra money, or you have to agree, you have to sign all these extra documents for part of the request. If the request is for an assistance animal, well, your landlord can't place breed or size restrictions on the animal. So a lot of places might have a no pit bull policy or a no, what it's considered aggressive breed policy. Um, they also can't charge you any pet fees, pet deposits. However, if you have an assistance animal and they do damage to your unit, you would still have to make any repairs that the animal caused, or you would be financially responsible for them when you move out. So with modifications, so just a reminder, modifications are physical changes to the home. So your landlord can require that it be done in a workmanlike manner. So you can't just sloppily have work done. Landlord can require that it be done in a safe and appropriate way. You can make sure that all building permits are secured if that's necessary, and that if anything's going to interfere with future use, it be restored to original conditions. The landlord can't say you can only use this one contractor. They can't say that exterior modifications be restored, and they can't require anything to be done just for an aesthetic reason if it's going to cost more. So, statute of limitations. So, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, you have a year from the date you were last discriminated against to file a complaint with HUD. You have 2 years from the last date to file a lawsuit. Under the Tennessee Act, you have 6 months, 180 days from the last discriminatory act to file a complaint with THRC, which is the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. You have 1 year from the date of the last discriminatory act to file a lawsuit. So those are really important dates to keep in mind of if you're considering filing a complaint, but maybe you've moved out, you want to settle down. I know a lot of people, if your landlord was discriminated against you, you have to move. You're dealing with a lot. You're dealing with a lot of stress. So you want to wait a little bit, and that makes sense. So just remember the 6 month and the 1 year timelines. Now, we're going to look at some issues. So, a lot of tenants hear the word fair in fair housing, and they have their own, we all have our own sense of what is fair. And if it's not fair, they think it violates the act. I've had people talk to you before, and they're like, they said they wouldn't approve me for housing because I have bad credit. They're discriminating against me based on credit. Well, yeah, they are, but it's not illegal to treat you differently because of your credit. That's maybe unfair. That's just how it is. That's how landlords have to make their decisions. So, I'm sorry, but that's a legal reason for them to discriminate against you. A lot of things that people think are fair housing act problems are just normal landlord-tenant problems. And it's important to have an idea of what issues could be landlord-tenant or what issues might be fair housing. I'm really sorry, my dog has been quiet all day and she just has to be barking now. My animals will embarrass me.
Okay. If you need a moment to do anything, you just let me know, okay?
There is nothing that will make her be quiet at this point.
Okay, no, you're good.
So here's some red flags. So if you're looking for a new place to live, here are some things to look at. If the landlord won't put anything in writing, they will only talk to you on the phone. They won't give you a rental lease. Um, if the properties look really bad and you know that it seems like there's a lot of turnover there, if you people are always complaining about they can never hear anything from any of the property managers, that's the problem. Or if the landlord only accepts cash, never issues receipts, that's something to look out for. One thing we really want people to be careful about is lease purchase or rent to own. I mostly hear it called rent to own, but if you hear it called lease purchase, contract for deeds, be skeptical. It's not that they're always bad, it's not that it's necessarily bad, but often these are preying on vulnerable people. Um, and there's not many protections for the tenant in that situation, and it could be very expensive. So we want people to be very careful when entering those kinds of agreements. So tips for spotting fair housing violations in your communities. So one thing to do is look at the tenants who are living in a certain place. Does the demographics of the people living there match the community? Is everyone a man in this one housing complex? Do you know a community is racially diverse, but everyone who lives in this one housing complex is white? Just be aware of those things. There's people sometimes think that I think some housing providers, some landlords think that, oh, if I just do a quick little write up on Facebook or Craigslist, that it's not really going to count as advertising. It is. So anytime you're putting any kind of post online about, oh, I have this unit available, the Fair Housing Act is probably going to apply. And sometimes people still write really discriminatory things in those posts. So it's important to be aware of. If you're a community, any kind of like provider in the community, take complaints that people make about fair housing issues seriously, and don't assume that um, they're overblowing a situation or that the tenant is wrong. We still see really horrific examples of discrimination in fair housing that are sometimes shocking considering the year we're in. So it's important to know that these things still do happen. Um, and educate yourself about the law and local resources who work to enforce the law. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to leave you with some resources, places to contact if you think your fair housing rights are being violated. So we're going to go through some little scenarios because for me, it's just always helpful to actually think through uh, what this would look like with real people. So Jane's landlord found out that Jane, who's a woman, is dating another woman named Sally. The week after the landlord found this out, Jane finds out that her rent's going to be going up an extra $50 a month at the end of her lease. She talked with other tenants and no one else received a similar notice. So this is probably a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Um, Almost everything, if you know any lawyers, you're going to know we're going to say, oh, it depends. So there's a possibility that it doesn't. Maybe no one else's lease is ending at the same time that James is, and everyone is going to get this notice maybe 2 months before their lease is over, and she's just the only one who's gotten it now. But the timing is concerning. So this would definitely be a situation worth investigating to see what else happened. So John sees that an apartment's available for rent, calls the manager, sets up an appointment to go look at the apartment. He and his boyfriend show up. They see that the two men are together, and the manager says, oh, I'm so sorry, the unit's been rented. 2 weeks later, he sees the apartment is still listed as available. So we talked about this earlier as the kind of discrimination that can happen. Saying that a unit's not available when it is. Um, And this is really common. This happens a lot, and this does look discriminatory. Again, it's possible that she rented it and then that person that she rented it to in the interim fell out. But this is definitely suspicious, and this is a situation that's worth looking further into. Scenario 3, Mary and her girlfriend have a lease, but they want to move out early. The lease says that they will lose their deposit and have to pay a month additional rent to terminate the lease early. Mary doesn't want to pay that, asks the landlord to waive the fee. The landlord refuses. That's fine. Mary agreed to that. This is what the lease says. The landlord isn't changing any terms of this agreement. The landlord is just saying, hey, this, you can leave early. Here's how the lease says that has to work. So there's not any fair housing violation discrimination happening here. Last scenario. William, his husband, and their kids are looking for a new rental property. They apply for a property, and the landlord denies their application because they have a bad rental history at their prior complex because they left the property damaged and they owed a balance for their rent. So in this situation, they're being denied housing, not because they're two men in a relationship, not because they have children, because they have a bad rental history. Bad rental history is the kind of thing that is usually fine to discriminate against on. So if you have a bad rental history, then you're kind of out of luck, unfortunately. So if you think you've been discriminated against, these are some organizations that are great to contact. So HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Their website here is where you can file an online complaint. You can find more about your fair housing rights. Tennessee Human Rights Commission, this is their website here. One thing that I didn't mention earlier, I meant to and I forgot, is that sex is now defined to include gender identity, sexual orientation. That's only federally. So if you have those issues and you want to file a complaint, you should file with HUD. However, if you do file with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission, they're going to just send that on over to HUD. So it's not really a problem, but it's important to know that that is part of the federal law now, but it's not part of our state and Human Rights Act. You can contact the Tennessee Fair Housing Council. They're one of our wonderful partners out in Nashville. You can also contact us, of course. However, beginning tomorrow, we're going to be administratively closed until July 12th. So maybe give it a little wait and then contact us. We do want to help with all your issues, but we do have that little administrative closure coming up. And I also want to say, if your organization could benefit from a personalized presentation on fair housing because of the issues that your community group sees, please contact me. That's my number, that's my email address. We'd love to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trina. We really appreciate you coming in and sharing this information. I was taking notes in my notebook. And thank you. That was a lot of wonderful information, especially for our communities and it being Pride Month, but also for those who are renters. And thank you for those examples as well. At this time, I want to give it a couple more seconds to see if we get any comments. We don't have any questions in our comment section as of now, but while we're waiting for a couple of questions, I do have a couple of updates. Just so you guys know, as a reminder, we are doing our fair housing session today. This is part of our summer series for LAS, the People's Court. We do have quite a bit of other Facebook Live series coming up. So our next one is going to be with our Eviction Right to Counsels team, and they're going to be talking about what your rights are as renters in regards to the eviction process. So please join us on Thursday, July 6th at 6 p.m. And then Thursday, July 13th, 20th, and 27th will be followed by a couple of other attorneys and some really great topics over the summer. Last but not least, we also have a name change clinic that is going to be coming up on July 15th. So if you're an individual who would like to get your name changed, there is a link, a QR code here that you can scan, but also there's a link in our Facebook story. So again, thank you all. And I'm going to go back to the comments to see if we've gotten any questions. Nope, we do not have any questions at this time, Trina, but I do want to say thank you again for joining us. Trina is amazing, a wonderful attorney, and very knowledgeable about this topic. So again, as she says, if you want more information about fair housing, if you want presentations done for your organization, please follow up with her and contact her. And I know that she'd be more than welcome to hit you up on that offer. Before we close out, Trina, is there anything else that you need to say or like to say?
No, thanks, Teresa, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this series.
All right, thank you. You all have a wonderful night.